Hello everyone and welcome to my big critique of Elden Ring. Elden Ring is a game that needs no introduction. It's a game that has been not only praised endlessly and titled one of the best games of all time by many, but also harshly criticized. It has some of the best highlights and best moments of the Souls series, while also having some of the worst. Enough time has passed, both in real life since the game released, and in hours of me playing, that I think I'm qualified to critique the game myself and say what I think it does well and what it doesn't. I have plentiful amounts of, some might say, too much experience with the game, and I've had time to step back and reflect. I'm going to be talking about each part of the game one at a time and discussing them, critiquing them, and providing my thoughts, starting with the gameplay. Gameplay is an essential component of any game. The Souls series is known for its challenging gameplay. It's known as being challenging, but the methods of challenging the player differ across games. On one hand, you have games like Demon's Souls or Dark Souls 1, which have slow, methodical, at times clunky gameplay. And on the other, you have fast-paced games like Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, or even Sekiro, although that game's combat is not as similar to the standard Souls formula. A trend is observable where games get faster as the series goes on, and Elden Ring holds true to that in some aspects. Broadly, the gameplay of Elden Ring is most similar to Dark Souls 3, however it draws inspiration from multiple games in the series, including Bloodborne and even Sekiro and Dark Souls 2. It's a mix of all the games in the series, having mechanics from all of them, some of which being implemented better than others. One of the mechanics that returned to Elden Ring is the weapon skill, now titled the Ash of War. Weapon skills were introduced in Dark Souls 3, and outside Elden Ring, that's the only game that includes them. In Elden Ring, Ashes of War are evolved from their version in Dark Souls 3 to feature a much more robust and diverse, and also sometimes overpowered implementation. Ashes of War, at least the non-unique ones, can be swapped and mixed and matched on most weapons to fit certain playstyles or builds, which allows for build variety and diversity in weapons that is unmatched. No other Souls game comes close to the amount of builds available, and the amount of weapons you can use in Elden Ring. Ashes of War can be added to a multitude of different weapons, and with an Ash of War you can change the affinity and scaling of your weapons to fit a certain build or stat. This provides, like I said, an unmatched amount of variety in weapons and builds, which results in seemingly endless experimentation and replay value, not considering other factors. Another returning feature is the jump, which admittedly does sound a little silly, but this is only the second Souls game to feature jumping as a mechanic, not counting the running jump. Jumping allows much more capabilities in a level design and traversing environments. It lets you move in a way that has never been seen before in Souls games, not counting Sekiro. That vastly broadens the ways levels can be designed and interacted with. It gives players more freedom in moving through vertical areas, and it was implemented well throughout the game, in legacy dungeons and open world areas. Not only this, it also allows new forms of combat. The jump attack is a very important component of Elden Ring's gameplay and combat. Besides being a powerful attack on its own, it gives the players more ability to move around while in combat. This ties into the jump's ability to act as a dodge. The jump is a very useful way to dodge many attacks, and it also sets you up to punish the attack in the process. It's a neat addition, providing many more opportunities in traversing areas, and also switching up the combat pretty significantly. However, there is one thing that I'm not the biggest fan of when it comes to jumping. If you're moving sideways and you jump for a jump attack, you'll jump in the direction you're moving, and this can cause you to miss your attack and jump away from the enemy. It looks silly and it can be frustrating, but I guess you just have to get used to it so you can stop moving and then go for the jump attack. Besides that though, the jump is a great mechanic in Elden Ring, and a great addition to the standard Souls formula. Stance is another mechanic that returns, once again from Sekiro. Stance is another great addition to the Souls combat. It makes it much more interesting and less repetitive when you're not only using one attack. It incentivizes the use of a broader range of attacks like charged heavies, which otherwise probably wouldn't have been used often. It spices up the combat, and it can get really interesting when you calculate in your head the amount of stance damage you're doing and the amount of stance an enemy has. You can pull off some pretty cool plays when you do a charged heavy right before an enemy hits you, and you break their stance when you otherwise would have gotten hit by that attack. You can even make builds around doing as much stance damage as possible. There are ways you can increase the amount of stance damage you do, and you can make a build around a certain weapon and have your playstyle focus on using certain attacks to deal maximum stance damage. Power stancing is also a feature that returns, this time from Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 gets a lot of hate, and most of it is deserved, but it also has a lot of good things about it, power stancing being one of them. Power stancing or dual wielding is another thing that gives Elden Ring such a vast diversity in builds. But when it comes to returning features, not all of them are done well. Stealth returns from Sekiro, and unlike Sekiro, which had a decent, albeit simple, stealth mechanic, stealth in Elden Ring is borderline useless. It's hard to even complain about the stealth in Elden Ring, because it's clear that it wasn't a main priority of the game. But it has its own button, and it is in the game, so I have to talk about it. In Sekiro, the levels were designed so that stealth was a pretty good option to traverse them. In Elden Ring, there are so few areas where stealth is useful that I wouldn't be surprised if you forgot it existed. Not only is the mechanic really shallow, but in most areas it's not even an option. There are a handful of areas where it is useful, but for the majority of your time playing, it's just not going to get used. Bosses don't allow stealth to be used at all, and most levels make it not an option. Besides for one armor set, there's nothing to make stealth a more viable option. There's no way to upgrade your stealth with a stat or something like that, and there's no special attacks you can do by utilizing stealth. The only reason to use stealth is to get easy backstabs. It is an incredibly shallow and poorly executed mechanic. It's a shame for it to end up like this and not get a little bit more attention, but it's clear that the focus was put towards other things. They implemented mechanics from other Souls games to create the aggressive style of combat that Elden Ring has, and stealth didn't get a lot of attention. Elden Ring isn't just a melting pot of the Souls series, it also introduces multiple new features of its own, one of which being Torrent. Being an open world game, Elden Ring has a very large world, and traversing it all on foot would be impossible, or at least it would take an absurdly long time. Torrent is of course the horse, our trusty steed, and I think they did a pretty good job with him, or her, I'm actually not too sure. For what they were trying to do, the developers did a decent job, but there are some things that I think are lacking or could have been done better. For one thing, combat isn't the best. Horseback combat is a difficult thing to do in a game, and I don't think Elden Ring's version is terrible, but it's not great either. Trying to attack with melee weapons while riding the horse is not the easiest thing to do because of Torrent's speed. This combined with Torrent's lack of ability to dodge results in, again, not ideal combat. Riding Torrent in combat unintentionally handicaps the player, so that more often than not, it's best to stay on foot. I use the word unintentionally because I don't think this was the developer's intention for the player to be at a disadvantage while riding Torrent. But either way, the clunky and awkward melee combat, combined with the lack of a means to dodge or block, makes using the horse not the best idea for most situations. Although I will say using ranged attacks is pretty good on Torrent. Using spells feels good, it doesn't feel clunky like melee weapons. And while the combat on horseback overall isn't the best, I do think that the actual movement and control Torrent has is really well done. Moving around and traversing the terrain feels good, especially with the double jump. Like I said, the control feels really good, and it just feels smooth to move around. The double jump is also a really good mechanic for moving around in the open world, or even platforming, and it makes Torrent feel useful for more than just moving faster. It gives him that ability that you otherwise don't have on foot. One thing that is a little bit annoying is that it doesn't stop you from taking fall damage. I can see why it is the way it is, but still it would be interesting if double jumping prevented fall damage. You can imagine all the ways players could move around in the world with this. It would be really cool, but again, I see why they didn't do that, so you could be able to skip to certain areas or get to places you shouldn't be. And at least for me, it isn't a big issue. Spirit summons are also a new introduction. Summons have obviously been in previous Souls games, but in Elden Ring you can now summon spirits to be your allies, which are basically just ghost enemies fighting for you. Spirit summons are a topic of debate within the community for using them in bosses. I personally don't use summons in bosses, but I don't think it's the end of the world if you do. But besides the debate about whether or not you really beat the game if you use summons, the actual mechanic of spirit summons are pretty good. It's kind of nice for you to be able to use a different summon. It's kind of nice for you to be able to use a summon without having to use multiplayer. And you can also use many different summons at different upgrade levels for the purpose you want. If you don't want a summon to absolutely trivialize a boss, you can use a weaker one, and that's not really possible when you summon a real player, or at least you don't know what you're gonna get if you summon a random. Being able to pick from the many spirit ashes available to you gives you a lot of freedom in experimenting with different spirits for certain encounters. On the actual gameplay level, spirit ashes are very helpful for diverting an enemy or boss's attention from the player. Some people say that doesn't count as actually beating the boss, but in my opinion, whatever makes you have the most fun is what you should do. That's why we play games, and after all, spirit ashes were put in the game to be used. But yeah, it can be fun to use spirit ashes on tough enemies, and again, it is nice for offline players to not have to use multiplayer. I usually don't use spirit summons for bosses, but the thing that I really like about summons is using them in dungeons or the open world. There are parts of the world where you're able to use summons, usually areas with a lot of enemies, and I think it's pretty fun to use them in places like that. Unless you have the drop on a group of enemies, and you're waiting to make the perfect attack, because your spirit ash is going to run in there for everyone to see, and there goes your element of surprise. Yeah, the AI isn't great on them, but besides that, I think they were implemented pretty well. One aspect of Elden Ring's gameplay is the speed of combat and the overall playstyle that the game encourages. Elden Ring moves fast, enemies are incredibly fast and acrobatic, and the gameplay itself is fast as well. You have to be fast and move fast to keep up, especially in late game areas. I'll get into this more with the bosses, but at least for when you aren't fighting a boss, the enemies are pretty fast. Not all of them, there are some that are your typical knights and whatnot. In fact, most of the standard enemies aren't super crazy, but there are some mini bosses that are really, like I said, acrobatic and fast. And relative to the player speed, some of them can feel a little bit too fast at times. I have heard people say how some of the enemies are faster than the player, or too fast for the game. I've heard people say how the player moves like Dark Souls 3, or even a little bit slower, while the enemies move like Bloodborne enemies. I think this can be true in some parts, but in general I don't really find the speed of enemies to be too big of an issue. You can definitely have a personal preference to not like that. I could see someone preferring the slower combat of Dark Souls 1, but on a gameplay level I think it works fine. And like I said, it plays like Dark Souls 3, which means it's super smooth and it feels good to control the character and dodge around. Guard counters are also a new mechanic to Elden Ring, and while they are cool and can be useful in some situations in dungeons and open world scenarios, shields as a whole are discouraged by the speed of combat. Like I said, the speed of combat is pretty fast, and for some enemies, guard counters and shields aren't really viable. For dungeons and open world areas, shields are fine, but for bosses they don't really work super well, especially in the late game. Shields are really discouraged by a lot of late game bosses with how fast they move, how big their attacks are and how much stamina it takes to block them, and with the elemental damage they do, which bleeds through shields. You still can make it work, but it's not going to be the best option compared to dodging. Going back to guard counters, they really aren't that useful in the late game bosses either. Like I said, bosses' attacks take a lot of stamina to block, and then to do a guard counter after that uses even more stamina, that it isn't the best option. But outside of bosses, I think it's a great mechanic. It's great to use on normal enemies, and it is a cool idea in itself to be able to block an attack and then counter with your own attack. Another part of the gameplay that I want to talk about is the spells. Magic has always been a controversial part of the Souls series. In Elden Ring, I think they handled magic really well. I think the magic in Elden Ring is probably the best it's been in the series. For one thing, there is an enormous variety of magic options with spells and weapons. There are lots of spells to use, and the spells are unique too. There's types of spells that are really wild and out there that we've never seen before. I mean, the sheer amount of spells and incantations is pretty crazy. But besides the actual spells, for magic builds there's a ton of different weapons with intelligence and faith scalings. Magic builds have a ton of stuff to work with in Elden Ring, and the builds are better than ever. In Elden Ring, it feels like hybrid builds are encouraged as well. Hybrid builds are really good in Elden Ring, where you have a mix of 2 damage stats, which previously wasn't the best build idea. But in Elden Ring, strength faith builds and dex int builds are 2 of the best types of builds you can make. It helps with all the different hybrid scaling weapons there are. Elden Ring has a lot of weapons with either hybrid magic scalings or pure magic scalings, which gives magic builds a lot of choices for melee weapons. On top of the faith and intelligence builds, Arcane is also a viable stat in Elden Ring. Previously known as luck, it was a stat that wasn't really useful, and you couldn't really make a build out of it. But now Arcane has its own spells, and you can make really powerful builds with them, specifically with the Dragon Communion Seal, if you put a little bit into faith so you can use faith incantations alongside the dragon incantations. A Dex Arcane build is also really good, and also quite infamous. But yeah, there's a ton of variety for spells and builds. But with magic, we of course have to discuss balance. Balance is often talked about alongside magic, because it can be a little rough sometimes in Souls games. Sometimes it's overpowered, and sometimes it's not that good. In my opinion, I don't think that magic in Elden Ring is that bad when it comes to balance. Of course, there is lots of stuff that can be overpowered, but there's also a lot of stuff that feels properly balanced. If you aren't going out of your way to make an overpowered magic build, I think the balance is pretty good. Elden Ring's magic is surprisingly well done. You can tell they focused a lot more time on magic this time. With the many magic weapons, the large amount of unique spells, and the actually good balancing. It feels like the game was designed and balanced with magic in mind. Like I said, there is some magic stuff that's broken and overpowered, but there's also plenty of stuff that's not magic that's just as overpowered. Magic builds also require a lot of stat investment and blue flasks, which helps to balance them out. So overall, I think magic in Elden Ring is really well done. Then there's the camera. The camera in the Souls series has always been a point of discussion, and that discussion usually involves negative criticism, to say the least. The camera has always been bad since the beginning of the series, and it still is. It is quite surprising how the camera is so consistently bad when the solution is as simple as it is. All that needs to be done is to zoom the camera out for certain encounters, but that still hasn't been done. This is especially bad in Elden Ring, where the bosses are so large and so fast that we have probably the worst camera in the series. Hitboxes are not great either in Elden Ring. Hitboxes in Elden Ring are really great sometimes and terrible at others. The hitboxes of sword attacks are shockingly precise and accurate, while the hitboxes of AoEs and grab attacks will leave you wondering how that hit you. Some attacks from bosses have slam effects, which can hit you even if you dodge the actual attack, which can be frustrating. And it can look silly sometimes when you get hit by a tiny piece of dust. They can be pretty bad sometimes, and the same is true of AoE attacks. Some AoEs have surprisingly large hitboxes where, again, you can be on the very outside, or even appear to not be in it at all, and still get hit. Grab attacks are not much better, Estelle being a particularly bad example. It's a shame how they were able to make such great improvements in sword hitboxes, while grabs and AoEs are consistently bad throughout the series. If you remember when I said at the beginning how Elden Ring is a mix of all the games in the series, featuring mechanics from all of them, that is true. However, the game also is missing many features that were previously used. Armor upgrades are one feature that have been missing for quite some time now, and it is a shame. Upgrading armor in Dark Souls 1 was a good way to keep up with the increasing amount of damage that enemies do, and this would be a great addition to Elden Ring. Elden Ring especially would benefit from this with its amazing fashion, combined with the insane amounts of damage some enemies can do. In general, upgrading armor would be a good thing in Elden Ring because of how much damage some enemies can do, but it would be even better because of how good the fashion is in Elden Ring. You can make an amazing outfit just to get absolutely shredded by enemies in the late game. Being able to upgrade armor would make it easier to have good fashion without taking absurd amounts of damage. Trick weapons have also been missing from the series. In fact, they've only appeared once, and Elden Ring would have been the perfect game for them to return in with its vast array of weapons. It would have been cool for a few weapons to have a trick ability where they can switch to another weapon. This combined with Ashes of War would create a very interesting type of weapon, and it's a shame it wasn't implemented. Another thing that for some reason wasn't implemented was covenants. Covenants are not a huge component of Souls games, but they are fun to see and interact with. Again, Elden Ring would have been the perfect game for this with all the different factions you would be able to side with. And speaking of covenants, this brings me to invading. Invading has always been tied to covenants, but on its own, it was a prominent feature of Souls games. Getting invaded was a thrilling experience when you're all alone deep in a level, far from a bonfire, and holding a large amount of souls. In Elden Ring, that experience is no longer possible. Yes, invading still exists, but it's only possible when you're in co-op or you're using the Taunter's Tongue. In other words, you know what's coming. This ruins that experience of being caught off guard by an invasion. It is a shame, especially with Elden Ring's level design and enemies, which could have led to some very interesting invasions. On the other hand, from the invader's perspective, this change isn't too bad. In the past, invading a solo host could often result in the host getting away from all the enemies, in which case it would just be a duel with healing. In Elden Ring, solo invasions are quite rare, which means you're always going to have the experience of invading a duo or trio, which is more exciting.